Termine de llegar, por lo que después de la ponencia de David vamos a hacer el receso de comida de 1:30 a 3 como ayer y después regresaremos a las últimas dos ponencias del bloque. Y la siguiente ponencia magistral de David Dodgers es sobre Prevention and Protection, Cooperative or Conflicting Ideas.
Okay, sorry, it's me again. Can we just put up, on the presentation I had before, I skipped one slide, which is actually one of the most crucial slides of the whole presentation. So I just wanted to put that up just so you could have a look at that, because this was meant to be there, and as you can see, if you read it, it's basically asking these questions about the need to clean. We talked a lot about how we did it and why we did it, but these are the questions that I think we should be asking ourselves, which is the stone dirty, and if so, is the presence of stone, of dirt damaging or just disfiguring? Is it necessary to allow surface treatment? How much is desirable? How much could be safely removed? Which is just basically, this is, I know you'll all be very happy to have your lunch at the end of this, but I will hope to entertain you sufficiently to make you forget about lunch. Prevention, I've called it Prevention, Moisture and Salts, a story of cooperation or conflict, because when I look at a lot of projects that I've either been involved with or I observed, and it seems to me sometimes that certain things that we do don't always, the long-term implications of what we're doing are not always understood, and that they can be in conflict with each other. So I hope that by the end of the presentation you will see what I mean. So we will crack on. But basically, what I'm going to do, first of all, is just remind ourselves what the general principles of conservation, why we're doing what we're doing, what preventive conservation is, some examples of it, and then I have 4 case studies, right, which illustrate different elements of what I'm talking about. So we could all write a slightly different version of this, but in the general purposes of conservation, it's to extend the life of cultural property and the values which we associate with it, to reduce the risk of catastrophic loss, to take steps to mitigate the causes of decay and reduce their effect, to carry out intervention treatment as necessary to protect and repair decayed surfaces, and to extend the effectiveness of interventive treatment by regular care and maintenance. Okay, so that's in 5 bullet points, is, to me anyway, the main principles. But you may have others, but that's fine. The great thing about conservation is there's no right or wrong. There's just lots of grey areas. And then as a sort of subset from overall conservation, we also have preventive conservation. So what are the main sort of general criteria for preventive conservation? Well, we can, again, summarize this as measures and actions aimed at avoiding and minimizing future deterioration or loss, defer, reduce, or eliminate the need for interventive treatment. Measures and actions, these measures and actions are indirect. They don't set out to interfere directly with the materials of the monument, but they may, well, they're not meant to modify their appearance, but we'll talk about that in due course. So if we think about preventive conservation, there's a lot of preventive conservation in museums and stuff, but if we take it outside to an external monument, it seems to me there are 2 main things that we're asking, that we're requiring of preventive conservation. And it's about preventing the ingress of moisture or the formation of salts, both of which can be potentially damaging, and both of which may be interlinked, or modifying or controlling the environment of the monument to mitigate the causes of decay. So again, these are the 2. We're now narrowing it down to just these couple of issues. And preventive conservation is understood to be carried out without intervening with the stone itself, right? So the control can be considered as reversible, although the effect on the stone may not be. So, Giorgio Taracca, the much missed Giorgio Taracca, in his lectures on porous building materials, said that any consideration of protection should always start with reference to those parts, roof, gutters, downpipes, cornices, windowsills, flashings, projecting elements, damp-proof membranes, drains, that were designed with the purpose of protecting it against water and which may not be functioning properly because of their own deterioration or defective design. And Giorgio wrote a lot of common sense, and this is one of the best paragraphs that he wrote, in my opinion, because it's something that is so important. So I'm going to show a few pictures of what he was talking about. So roofs, we take them for granted, really, don't we? That a roof is there to protect our house, and they may be made of slate or thatch or tile or mud or any sort of material. But it's designed to protect us from rainfall, essentially. And so, they can be, this is Cardiff Castle in Wales, massive expanses of lead roofs, okay? And that's fine, and you think that's all terrific. But then when you realize that every single piece of roof you can see there, which includes this all this up here, all this, is all draining into one gutter here. Okay, and then it's going out of the spout there. And not surprisingly, it's coming out of this spout. Not surprisingly, when it rains, there's rather a lot of water coming out. And so its control is non-existent. And it will, as you can see, it will splash over the masonry. It gets in through the window, through the flashing. It's, it's running down the wall. So the management of rainwater has got as far as the roof being efficient, but then the next step on the way is now been is no longer working. We have lead flashings, which are to try and protect the interface between a roof and a piece of masonry. Self-evidently, that's a weakness in any system. That's a weakness, but we need to be able to make sure that it's working effectively. And cornices, which cornices are designed as weatherings. They are designed to protect the stone beneath. They're designed to throw water clear. But in that design, they basically work on the fact that there's a little throat normally underneath, which throws the water clear. And the moment that erodes or doesn't work properly, then the water will just track back onto the stone. So we introduce cornices like this we introduce protection of cornices or protection like this. And that's fine until you see somebody has gone and put a ladder against it to put up the Christmas decorations, and you can see there, and that's pushed the lead back against the stone, and you can see now the water is beginning to track down the cornice. Okay, so these are just some of the issues that you see in terms of these things that Taracca talked about. We have windows with pointing between lead and stone. Very difficult. They have very different thermal characteristics. Lead expands a lot when heated. Stone doesn't, not much anyway. So any mortars there will crack, and the moment you have a crack, then capillary action means that the water will start to come in. And a cornice protection to cornice can also, of course, be an effective repair strategy for failing stonework. So it's just wherever you go, you will see things that aren't working as they should be, right? And this is water. This is in Sharjah and the United Arab Emirates, water being discharged, but onto a hard surface where it's splashing back onto the gypsum walls, and gypsum and moisture are not good companions. And this was at an opening of a recently restored house in Nazareth in the West Bank in Palestine. And there was a grand opening, and I was there because I had been involved in some of the project, and all I could notice was the fact that no one had paid attention to the roof, because that was clearly still leaking quite dramatically. Plastering was done beautifully, but it won't last long. And of course, when we have, gutters are not there for decoration, they're there for a purpose, which is to lead water down from the top of the building and to dispose of it in a managed way at the bottom. And that's very hard when you have trees growing out of the middle of the pipe, and clearly that's not going to work very well. And again, wherever you go, you will see things blocking it from dead birds to vegetation to all sorts. This is my favorite, is here. So the water comes down here. Somehow it's meant to leak from there, into that gutter, down there, and then down there. It's no surprise that doesn't work very well. So, and this is on a very important church, I mean, how did we get there? How did it possibly happen that we could construct something so complex and useless? And then when we get water down to the bottom, we want to dispose of it in an organized way. So we want it to go into a nice drain, or here we want it to go in a nice drain. Unfortunately, the water falls well away from the channel, so it just seeps back into the wall, and then on the inside you start to see the results of water not being properly channeled, and you get salts. And then you get deterioration, and so on. This whole sort of scheme happens, and it's all happening because of something so simple, which we could put right. And this is actually a very early. There is a slate damp-proof membrane installed in the 19th century there. So if you've got damp-proof membranes, then they need to work, but also they probably don't need to be within 20 millimeters of the stone of the surface, because water will splash above them. So, all of these things, it feels like just, it's so simple, but it's really effective conservation. And we shouldn't be too proud to actually be looking at these things. Because then when we get salts, we get the problems we all know about it. And, it was good to hear Claudia's description of the problem of salts. And, they're everywhere. I mean, I just, wherever you go, and poor old Venice again. I'm sorry to keep on harping about Venice, but I want to cry about what's been happening. Anyway, we've tried to reduce the moisture now. We're trying to control the moisture, right? Now, we can't stop it raining, but we've got to make sure that we ensure that existing measures are working properly. It's really simple, but it's so important. So we could reach for additional protective measures, perhaps shelters. And I'm about to start talking about shelters. When I say managing the external environment, I don't mean that we're controlling the rainfall. What we're doing is just things like, trees can affect the way, as we showed with the War Memorial earlier, which went green very quickly because of trees above it. Or indirect rainfall, where water is, as with Cardiff Castle, water is coming from one place and affecting something else. We can, of course, insert membranes to isolate the monument from groundwater. And again, we'll see examples of that. Or we can manage internal environments, particularly to reduce condensation. So that's it. Moisture and salts, they sort of go together, but I'm differentiating them for the purpose of this presentation. So in order to reduce the impact of salts in a preventive way, we can try and remove the moisture source that's required for the salts to mobilize and crystallize. We can actually just do something as simple like management. As they appear, you remove them. And there's a big, a very important station in London called St Pancras Station, and it was it was completely restored at the beginning of this century. And they, you know, there had been no roof for a long time. They put the roof on, and then people were eating their at McDonald's or something, and they were eating their hamburger just beneath the brick walls, and large bits of salt kept on falling down. There's enough salt in a McDonald's hamburger already. It didn't need any more. But so we need to, you know, and so now they have a process that every few weeks they go around and they remove them from the surface. Removal of the source of salts, quite difficult, but possible. Poulticing to remove existing salts, and providing alternate moisture paths for preferential crystallization of salts. So we'll see some examples of that, all that stuff. So how do we, you know, assess these things and how well they've worked? Well, you know, well, these are the questions that we should be asking. You know, is how do we assess it? You know, what criteria are we using to see if it's been successful or not? And again, we'll have a look at that in a minute. Do we do enough to understand how a new change will affect the equilibrium the monument has with its environment? Because everything is about that equilibrium that exists. And can we ensure that the fundamental concept of do no harm is not being compromised? I have examples of shelters designed and constructed for the best possible reasons, but actually they've led to more problems than the ones that they've saved. So each monument is distinct, and there's no consensus really as to what parameters should be used to measure success, as we like to call it. So just some few pictures of shelters that I've sort of come across over the years. This is in Sri Lanka. And there's actually a painting on the inside of this wall. This is a shelter, and I thought, well, actually, that's pretty good, really. I mean, it allows, you know, the wind, and it protects it from the rain, and it doesn't make an enclosed space too much. I have no idea whether it works or not, but I took the picture. This is in Ostia Antica in Rome, where the shelter that's been put up here has clearly not contributed, well, has contributed to this level of salts. I don't know what it was like before the shelter, but it's certainly no better now, and they've got a salt problem. This is a good shelter. This little bit of glass up here is to protect that little bit of plaster. I'm sure it's terribly effective, but again, I don't know how you possibly measure whether that's doing any good or not. And then you have the enormous shelter over a Buddha, again in Sri Lanka. And again, probably protecting it from direct rainfall, which is, you know, we hope is beneficial. But maybe it's been used to being wet, and now it's dry. What are the implications of that? This is in a Roman site in Malta, Hagia Sophia, where years ago, over the best bit of the site, which is a lovely mosaic, marble and mosaic floor, they put a nice plastic roof to protect it. It is, I mean, it's hot in Malta anyway in the summer. It's about 40 degrees. I can't tell you what the temperature is like inside that place. So they protected it with, not only with the plastic, but also with boxes on top. It is no surprise that it's actually, and this is with the boxes removed, you have these sort of little benches and stuff. They are, you know, failing catastrophically from salts, because you've got groundwater and you've got a very, very hot environment. So groundwater is just being soaked up into them and bringing with it salts. And that's just a sort of close-up of that. So now let's look at some of these examples. So we have the Roman bathhouse in London. And for each one, I'll give a very brief history and hope that you can picture a bit what it's like. So this is a 3rd century house that was excavated in 1848. It consists of stone and tile walls with pili and tesserae. The River Thames is less than 50 meters away, so groundwater levels vary very considerably. It suffers from significant salt crystallization, especially in the porous materials like the tiles. And it's set within a basement of an office block. Now, this office block has been refurbished twice in the last 40 years, and each time the whole site is buried in order to protect it, and then it's re-excavated. Perhaps they should just left it buried, might be. Anyway, so that's basically it. It's very typical, sort of with a tepidarium, a frigidarium, a caldarium, and various other rooms. It's not very grand, but it's quite interesting. So I thought I had some pictures, and maybe, oh yes, I do. Okay, so before we see the pictures, the various options that we had a look at were reburial, right? If you've got this stuff that is just because it's exposed and it's got this water moisture, you cannot possibly isolate it all from the floor. We talked about trying to monitor and control the environment, but it's a big space. And also you've got vents that go straight out onto the pavement level, so the humidity when it rains is massive, goes way up. Poulticing was impossible except on some of the pili and some parts of the tesserae, which were isolated using lead. But how we actually ended up doing it was we put sacrificial mortars applied around the areas of Roman plaster, and this crushed limestone sand used over all the areas of the site surrounding above ground archaeology. So that will make more sense when you see some of the pictures. So we have here some of the pili here, which used to support the floor with the steam and whatever coming in underneath. So these are the things that were suffering badly. We were able to lift those and lay them back onto lead membranes. And that's another part of the bathhouse. And again, we were able to lift all these and reset the tiles. But what you can see around here is this crushed limestone, okay? And that's a very porous material. And it's designed for moisture to come up preferentially through that material. And you can see here, actually, this area of tesserae has been lifted. We rolled it up and relaid it on a lead tray to isolate it. And here you see how the salts appear. You can see this is a thing to monitor the groundwater level. But you can see salts appearing, and then there's many more salts. So we have sort of achieved quite a lot. And there you can see that we use different colors as well to help show which areas were part of internal rooms and which parts were exterior. So there's an interpretation board that explains all of this. So if we look at a summary evaluation of that particular project, right, it's open to the public, which is, I guess, welcome, because otherwise it was just lost in a basement. Groundwater levels, we can't do anything about those. The River Thames will flow. Salt levels are still high. We haven't been able to do anything about the salt levels. But what we can do is take the top layer of sand, the top 50 millimeters, and it's scraped off and removed every 5 years and replaced with less salt-rich sand. There is a small amount of continuing intervention required because salts, they are present in the walls. We can't get rid of them. So I wanted to put this in because it's a very light touch, but what we've done is we've looked at the problem and realized that there's a good preventive measure, which is putting the sand, the porous sand, around the material in order to get a preferential path for moisture. And I think that's better probably than trying to well, certainly you can poultice because you have a vast vat of salts that would be endless. So the second one I want to look at is Rochester Castle, which is a 12th century keep constructed from local ragstone and mortars made from lime and sea sand and crushed shell. So bear that in mind. And originally the exterior was rendered. This is a massive building. It's absolutely enormous. I ought to have put a scale against it, but anyway, it was a brief history, besieged by King John in 1215, resulting in the destruction of the southwest corner, repairs in the 14th century, but a ruin since 1600. Then it was passed into the Weldon family. They wanted to demolish it in 1738. That would have been a contract and a half. Lot of spare stone there. And the council then took on the lease. Repairs carried out in 1883, major repairs in 1897, and these various things were carried out. And that's a view down from the top, looking downwards, and it goes down 5 floors. There is no floors left, no roof. It's just a massive, massive structure. And interestingly, no one has been on this for a long time, but it has developed its own sort of soft capping, a protective capping of grass. So this is it from the second floor looking upwards. So you can see it's quite a structure. So in the recent history, 1991, proposals for re-roofing and restoring the ground and basement floors drawn up, but not implemented wisely due to doubts about the effect of altering the microclimate of the keep interior and changing its appearance. Because by now, Rochester Castle means no floors, no roof. It has those heritage values. And obviously to put them all back and then try and hold weddings or whatever in them would be not really complementary to those values. So if only they'd read that, but they didn't, because then later on, 2004, the poor state of the walls is an ongoing problem, urgently requires resolution. Severe winter conditions are likely to cause accelerated deterioration. While the monument lacks its roof, the walls are receiving double the amount of weather they were designed for. And so they proposed, as preventive conservation measures, the tops of the wall should be permanently covered, a parapet coping should be provided rainwater pipes to discharge the water, and to a main roof to the castle keep to protect it from rainfall. So you'd have a roof and a drainage system, and all would be well. But of course it wouldn't be. So there have been a number of previous interventions, some with cement pointing. There is some continued deterioration of the original mortar on the external and internal walls. Not surprising, because they're built of sea sand and shells, so very high chloride levels. And rainwater falls on the top of the walls and then runs down the walls or between cracks in the paving and into hollow areas and vaults within the walls. So, it's not a place you go and have a picnic when it's raining, because you might get wet. So internal salt decay. So we did nearly 3 years, and we collected a total of 10 kilos of material, which equates to 0.01 cubic meters, okay, of mortar. This was one of the reasons why they wanted to put a roof on, because they felt that they were losing too much. So at that rate, so over 3 years, it's lost 0.01 cubic meter. I reckon there's 500 cubic meters of mortar in that thing. So I think that works out at something like 150,000 years before all the mortar is deteriorated. But of course, which is not a serious comment, but the deterioration is very slow. It's very gradual. And we really shouldn't be, that's how stone and mortars decay, in a very gradual way. They will eventually reach a point where maybe there will be catastrophic loss, but we're certainly not there yet. So for the moment, let's bother to do anything that would compromise the current situation. So there's lots of chlorides, as I said. So on the external stonework, there's minor loss of flakes of stone, which is very typical of the stone it's made for. The actual original construction has these very small coin stones, which is made of a stone from Caen in Normandy in France, and massive rag stones. So those are particularly sort of vulnerable. We did a lot of environmental monitoring, including, and so here you've got absolute humidity and dew point. So when the green and the red at the bottom, when they cross, you get condensation. So one's from mid-level, one's from low level, and if you swap, you can see there's different condensation rates happening between the two. And when you get condensation, that's when you get activation of salts, etc. We also were fortunate enough to have a photographic archive from 102 years before, very early photographic, 1906. Part of the reason that the project had been proposed was the thought that there had been oh Christ, what have I done now? Help. Okay, sorry, I'll just flip through these and hope to. Nearly there. So one of the one of the reasons was that they thought there had been significant decay of particularly these columns, and we looked at compared the old photograph with the new photograph and found almost no change. Right, it was a perception that there was deterioration happening. We did plotted how the sun falls on the roofs to see how that works. This is some of the original original render on the exterior. Anyway, so we basically ended up by saying, don't do anything. Please, please do not put a roof on this. Because by putting a roof on it, you're going to change all those stable, semi-stable environments inside. You're going to start drying out the floors and the walls. You're going to have then potentially very damaging, perhaps not catastrophic, but very damaging results. So, evaluating that, we've got, it's still open to the public, although they are excluded from 3 sides of the exterior. Because of falling flakes, and it's tiny, it's like powder. So the masonry remains stable, but with medium-term aim to replace the external render, because that would be a perfect protection to reinstate that, not try and bother with the roof, but to put the render back on. There's continued maintenance required, but it showed that retaining the existing equilibrium would be less damaging to the stonework and to the heritage values of the place than the proposed intervention. And it saved £2 million. So I think that's a pretty good deal, frankly. So the third one is Howden Minster, which is up in the north of England. Again, a brief timeline, constructed in 1300 to 1350. And then, well, the lower sections and then the upper sections a bit later. The Reformation in 1548 lost its endowments and basically became pretty derelict. And then the roof collapsed in 1650, so it was then abandoned. And then it was split into 2 sections, so a functioning church and a ruin. And then, it hasn't had a happy history. The roof and windows were then destroyed in a fire. And, go on, there we go. So it then spent 234 years as a ruin without a roof. And then, it does it when I don't want it. And then in 1984, it was taken into the guardianship of English Heritage. And they decided that in order to make it a place where people could go and visit, it would be a good idea to put a roof on as a preventive measure and to make the environment that much better. It's actually turned out to be a catastrophic failure. So it was put on the monument and the drainage was improved in an effort to preserve the intricate carving from weathering. Immediately after the roof was put on, the deterioration of the interior intensified considerably. And then there were treatment trials to consolidate, and they proved unsuccessful. So then there was set up a research collaboration between English Heritage and the Getty Conservation Institute, which I was involved with, to investigate the reasons for this very damaging deterioration. And this is the sort of thing that was happening. you can see this is, you know, it's just the surface is just collapsing repeatedly. And so once one bit has fallen away, then the next bit falls away. Time-lapse photography just showed, it's a pretty boring watch actually to watch through a whole sort of 1 year of time-lapse film to try and spot when the flake falls off. What we were trying to do is see if there was some change in environment that happened which triggered the loss of material. Without success, it has to be said. But here you have the very decorative interior. This is the area that started showing the catastrophic decay. And you can see, and basically that's the area of loss in 4 years was lost. And then you do decay mapping of there are 8 faces like this. It's an octagonal structure. And you do a decay mapping, and you can see, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of biological growth, which is the green at the bottom because it's constantly saturated. And you've got a salt efflorescence, which is sort of going in a slight sort of path rising upwards. So you can look at that and you can try and work out what on earth is happening, because at this stage we're thinking, why has this, you know, what's the problem? Because externally, the stone is fantastic. It's in really good condition, right? So there's certainly something weird has happened. We did a lot of investigation with infrared thermography, gravimetric sensors, surface temperature sensors, ambient temperature, electromagnetic profile sensors, all of these things to try and work out what was happening. And the annoying thing is that the answer was staring us in the face, really, the whole time, which is, sorry, I'll just go, I'll tell you, it's exciting story, isn't it? Anyway, so salt we looked at the salt mixture, and it's calcium sulfate, sodium chloride, sodium nitrate, but mostly magnesium sulfate, because it's made of magnesium limestone. I should have said that ages ago. Accelerated weathering tests showed that using that combination of salts showed that this brand new stone lasted 6 weeks before it collapsed. We noticed that the structure, despite its open windows, buffers the external environment, so there's not the contrast. But condensation events took place regularly in the mid and upper sections of the decorative panels, which is where all the deterioration was happening. And if you look at magnesium sulfate, this is the phase diagram, and you can see what we've got, probably temperatures here. So it goes in and out of solution as the relative humidity changes. So this was where we were looking at the problem. There's Howden Minster, goes 7 kilometers west, and there's Drax Power Station. And Drax Power Station pumps out 100,000 tons of sulfur dioxide every year, or used to. They say they've cleaned it up now. And the prevailing wind basically comes from this direction. So we had this Minster was serving as a sort of as a vat for sulfur dioxide, which then was collecting on the surface. Now, I think in this picture, you can just see the two. There's Howden Minster, and there you can just see the chimney of Drax Power Station. So basically what's happening is that the sulfur dioxide was landing on the surface of the stone, but in the old days, before there was a roof, it was mostly washed off by rainwater, internally, externally. There was a balance between the two. There wasn't any significant moisture movement. We put a roof on, and we immediately changed that equilibrium. And what it changed was it meant that condensation could collect on the internal faces, and the sulfur dioxide reacts with the stone, which is magnesium limestone, to form magnesium sulfate. It's a simple way of expressing what's actually a very complex reaction. But essentially, that's what we established. So it's closed to the public because there's still a lot of deterioration happening. So the main intention of installing the roof has not worked. It highlights the need for this very thorough assessment before any project like this is done. That didn't happen. It was just this feeling that putting a roof on it would be helpful. So preventive conservation like that, you know, and it seems logical. People would say, yeah, of course, it's a very good idea. But then you need to understand exactly what's going on. But I suppose as a benefit, it has led to a detailed research project into magnesium limestone, still to be published, but it will happen. And what I should say also is that what were we going to do about this? And the only solution we tried poulticing, which was, I think actually this next slide. We tried poulticing, which just didn't work, and it's too friable, the surface. We tried consolidation. We tried all sorts of things. Eventually, we went for a very, very porous mortar, applied almost as a render, a shaped render, so we didn't lose all the decorative material. And so that was, and these are trials which are still under review, but we applied mortars, and you can see here that's the mortar, and then within a couple of years, it has failed. The mortar has failed. So what we're reaching towards here is using mortar as a permanent porous poultice, if you like. It's a lot of P's there, but anyway. So that was the third one. So, you know, something done with good intentions. You know, no one deliberately goes out there to cause damage, but done with good intentions, and actually the side effect is that we've had a much worse situation. So I think this is the last one, which is the Lalibela rock churches, which I don't know if any of you have been to in Ethiopia, which are absolutely magnificent. I was there last year as I've been there as a tourist about 10 years ago, and I was there last year as representing ICCROM on a UNESCO visit. I have never heard such aggression. We had a meeting the first day we were there, and 300 people turned up. And there were 3 of us sitting at a desk like this, and 300 people out there, and they all were being abusive to us, basically. Luckily, they were speaking Ethiopian, so I couldn't understand. But it was because they were fed up, absolutely fed up with specialists coming along for years and years and telling them what should happen. So the story behind it is that, you know, they're constructed in the 12th century by King Lalibela, and they're still used as a spiritual center of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So it's still really important places. They're not by any means redundant. They're hewn from the rock as a monolithic block that were then further chiseled out, forming doors, windows, columns, floors, roofs, etc. The rock is basalt, so it's a porous, clay-rich upper layer with significant discontinuities overlying a less permeable basalt. So shelters were erected over 5 of the churches. There are 12 of them. Funded by the EU, the shelters were justified by the need to create temporary protection of the churches from weathering and water infiltration, while conservation studies are undertaken and conservation activities implemented. So this is St. George, which is one of the most famous of the, and probably in the best condition. So just, you know, if you can imagine starting up here and just, you know, gradually working the rock down and removing it and leaving this column in the middle, which you then excavated to form rooms. So these are, and on the right there, you can see the shelters that were erected. I think anybody would find it hard to say that they're sympathetic to the church. They're very brutal, steel and fabric shelters in very close proximity to the churches. So let's go back a bit. How these churches used to work was that the local priests, and there are 300 priests still involved in the 12 churches, okay? So they would make sure that the local craftsmen looked after the churches. They used clay and plant materials to fill the cracks, animal urine to kill biological growth, and in the rainy season, they would apply sheepskin. Each family had to supply a sheepskin, which they then sewed together and applied to the roof, right, in order to protect churches. But that gradually has fallen away, right, for maybe because people moved out, or they just lost the will to do it, or possibly because the experts started arriving. And the experts started arriving in the 1950s, and they carried out significant interventions using cement mortars, limited reconstruction, crack monitoring. But since then, there has been, I can't tell you how many reports prepared by people about what they should do, how it should be done, and all the time local involvement decreased, right? And as a result, there's massive political distrust between all parties. So this was why we were being abused at our meeting, because we were just another representative of the experts. So this is just some old pictures from an archive of the local craftsmen just sort of filling cracks. And this was actually a traditional shelter, which, as you can see, is an earlier shelter, which was constructed, I think, in the 1950s, which on a timber structure, a little bit more sympathetic. And that there's only one of those, and it protects this church that's in very, very poor condition. So the problems arise because, first of all, the shelters have never been maintained. And they were designed for a maximum wind speed of 40 miles an hour. Right? And now, last year, there were, I think, 7 occasions when it exceeded that. So the shelters started rattling, the people get alarmed, the people get alarmed, and they want to have the shelters removed. Unfortunately, because of all these mistrusts, no conservation has been carried out on the protected churches since the shelters were erected. Remember, that was one of the main purposes. Meanwhile, the equilibrium has completely changed, so the clays in the rocks have completely dried out, right? And a lot of it is smectite. And so many of the roofs are now actually crumbling, much, much worse than they ever did. Okay? 2 of the unprotected churches have been conserved under the direction of Italian Conservatives in 2018. And the local people are demanding the removal of the unsafe shelters immediately. So what happens? You take the shelter away straight away, and immediately what you've got is a roof that is crumbling. And the first time it rains, then the clays will start to expand. So you have a whole new equilibrium being established. And while that new equilibrium happens, more deterioration will happen. So our proposal was that we should concentrate on the roofs and do some conservation and repairs to the roofs, then dismantle the shelters, monitor it for a year or 2, and carry out any necessary works to the roofs. And it was a procedural thing, but of course it wasn't fast enough. That wasn't going to be fast enough. They want the shelters gone now. And they had a massive protest, and unfortunately the government said, yes, that's what we'll do. But although I think because it's a World Heritage Site, the World Heritage Committee have prevented them from doing that. So I mean, here you have one of the shelters over the roof here. As you can see, it's not terribly pretty. And you have, this is just an example of the crumbling, which is really bad in stages. I mean, the other thing is, this is the view from the hill above, right? So you're not really seeing Lalibela and its churches. What you see is these 4 rather ugly white shelters. And this is one of the roofs that's now been protected with a lime mortar, using, as far as possible, traditional, authentic techniques, but laid on a mesh to provide some coherence. I don't know. There's been 1 rainy season since that was installed. I don't know how it happened. So the summary evaluation of that is, certainly the story's not over, and there is the potential for it to get much worse. It's a really sorry tale of reaching for a solution without understanding the effect on the rock itself, the local community, the heritage values, and the social, religious, and environmental context in which the monument sits. So the desire to save the churches from water ingress, as we've discussed, which is good preventive conservation, has actually led to significant further deterioration and no obvious solutions. That's a sorry thing to leave you with, isn't it? It's not a happy tale, and it's I don't know, if you could do it all over again, I think you would just sort of get rid of. You would actually go in there at a very early stage and try and do some capacity building in the local people to try and revert to the traditional ways of doing things. So this is only 4 slides long, but this is, I added this late on last night. These are the temples in Malta, on the coast of Malta. Again, excavated in 1839, constructed of local bedrock and soft limestone. There's deterioration from weathering, including rainfall, increasing salt levels, and sharp thermal fluctuations, because it gets very hot in Malta, as I said. There's been some cracking of the megaliths and collapse. So there was a review, and so shelters were erected, and they were designed to be in place for 15 years and to allow for assessment, analysis, and remedial conservation. So there you have a shelter. And again, I mean, shelters, and I know that they're hard to make look pretty, but this is a wonderful, wild piece of coastline. And it just sort of, it doesn't do anything for me, particularly this one, which is, part of its significance, part of its heritage values is that on Midsummer's Day at the solstice, the sun is meant to shine through a doorway and fall on an altar. Well, there's not going to be any sun shining through that doorway because it's got a shelter over the top of it. So it's compromised those values considerably. But having said that, it's all been very carefully monitored. There's a lot of work going on. And I would really very strongly advise, if you're interested in this, to go and read that, because I think it's the most honest assessment that I've seen for a long time about the issues, what they did, why, how they did work, how they didn't work. It's a really excellent paper. So I would, if you're interested, definitely go and read it. But essentially, in order to save you reading it, the initial results are there's been a drop in thermal fluctuations. So the environmental conditions have been buffered by the shelter, as in the extremes have been compressed together. There's been a reduction in wind erosion, although the wind, interestingly, is now more turbulent inside the shelter than outside it, with sort of unknown results. Salts are still forming, although the rate appears to be reduced. But what is happening is the floors are all drying out, so you're getting a lot of dust. And a lot of salts that were in the floors are now being, because there's lots of visitors, they're being put into becoming airborne and then settling on the horizontal surfaces. So the key lessons, and these are taken from that document, is that the microenvironment in a newly sheltered site is a transitional stage that does not necessarily reflect longer-term trends. And that's really important because we're actually finally looking at a longer term rather than, as I was saying at coffee break, too often we do a project, we look at it, we maybe review it after a year, and then it sort of goes into the archive. And we're not good at going back and learning from what's happened. So they're saying that long-term monitoring is therefore required. The choice number of environmental parameters to be monitored needs to be informed by a careful consideration of their sustainability, both in terms of equipment and human resources. And this arose because if you're monitoring loads of things, you need people to go and visit and download it and interpret it and all the rest of it. Maybe you're just taking data for the sake of data without actually knowing what it is that you want to use the results for. So a monitoring program needs to be open to re-evaluation and revision where needed. And as more data is accumulated from different sheltering projects, it will become more feasible to establish performance indicators in advance of a sheltering intervention on the basis of which to evaluate its performance. So where we started by the thing is we don't know how to measure success, but if we use more of these sort of examples, we can begin to put together something that will tell us when we've been successful. The experience of these projects should be used to inform a checklist of key considerations for anyone considering whether to shelter an archaeological site. The foremost consideration is that every site requires a site-specific strategy tailored to its needs. The decision whether a shelter is desirable and what its performance requirements should be may only be taken in the context of such a strategy. So, I think that's it, actually. I think I'll finish there. So it's a good place to finish because it actually shows us that there is a way forward. But all of the examples that I showed, you know, there are, it's about very thorough assessment, and if you don't have thorough assessment, then you run the risk of potential damage, because moisture and salts, they're complex interactions, they're very hard to control, and we need to be very aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it. Again, just like cleaning. Okay, thanks very much for attention. I hope you can now have your lunch. It's lunchtime, of course not. Good. Are you going to do it in English or Spanish?
Thank you, David. Quería preguntar.
Sorry, I'm just turning on.
Okay. Te quería preguntar sobre los recubrimientos de sacrificio por los que optaron en, creo que era el tercer caso. El del techo, sí, ¿no? Olvidé el nombre del edificio.
The mortar.
Sí. ¿Cuáles fueron como los criterios para decidir las características del mortero? ¿Hicieron pruebas o fue sobre la marcha que realizaron el mortero final?
Okay, thanks for that question. Yes, we did do some tests, but we started with the premise that we didn't want to use anything with magnesium in it because that would just contribute more. So we decided we would have to use a calcium lime, not a magnesium lime. Okay. And secondly, we thought we want to make this as porous as it's possible to be. We knew that by doing so, we were sacrificing the matching of the mortar to the stone because it's a very fine-grained, microporous stone. Okay, so if we attempted to make a mortar that matched it, we weren't going to get the right characteristics of the mortar that we wanted. So we tried out a few mortars, and as I say, it's still under review, but the one that we think we've ended up with, it has a design life of maybe 3 or 4 years before it has to be removed and redone, you know. So it's not perfect, but it's at least what it's doing is stopping the deterioration of the underlying stone. Whether it's a sustainable solution, I don't know. But I think the direct answer to your question is that with a lot of experience, I thought I knew what the best mortar would be. There was nothing more complex than that. I think everybody has heard quite enough of me.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Thank you very much, David. Y ahorita vamos a ir a la comida. Les quiero recordar que los ponentes tienen un precio especial en el buffet de 150 pesos y el resto de los participantes, si tienen credencial de Lina, tienen derecho a 50% de descuento a la carta en el restaurante de aquí del museo. Y vamos a regresar a las 3:15, por favor. 3:15.
a todo el público del auditorio, favor de no dejar ningún tipo de pertenencias, cuídense.